The silence inside the expansive Sterling Ridge estate in Aspen, Colorado, was so thick it felt as though it could be sliced with a knife. This was not the tranquil, comforting silence of a peaceful home, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a luxurious tomb where a man lay waiting for his inevitable end. Adrian Sterling lay completely motionless on his state-of-the-art orthopedic bed, staring blankly at the intricately designed ceiling. His eyes were the only part of his body he could still move freely, and within them lay a vacuum so profound and devastating that it frightened anyone who dared to hold his gaze. The catastrophic accident had occurred at the most cruel moment possible, precisely when his vast corporate empire was reaching its absolute pinnacle. A single instant of distraction during a torrential mountain snowstorm, a massive truck sliding out of control on the icy highway, the horrific sound of twisting metal, and then nothing but total darkness, followed by an even darker reality. He suffered total paralysis from the neck down, an irreversible condition. The chief medical officer's words still echoed. The extensive damage to his spinal cord was completely irreversible. He would never walk again, never move his arms, never regain his independence. That pronouncement had been made 8 months ago. The absolute worst part of his condition was not the physical paralysis itself, but watching everyone who had once sworn to love and support him slowly drift away like rats abandoning a sinking ship. His corporate business partners had been the first to disappear. They made 3 polite visits during his first week at the hospital, filled with empty promises, then nothing but formal, legal documents delivered by aggressive attorneys that systematically transferred control of the companies he had built. His longtime friends from the exclusive golf club lasted only a little longer. 2 weeks of occasional text messages and expensive flower arrangements, followed by absolute silence. Adrian understood the message perfectly. He was no longer of any practical use to them. But what truly tore his soul apart was the devastating betrayal of his immediate family. His wife Victoria had remained by his bedside for exactly 2 months. Each subsequent visit became briefer, each look colder, each word filled with barely contained resentment. On her last visit, she stood beside his bed maintaining physical distance and said she simply could not do this anymore. She could not spend the rest of her prime years caring for an invalid. Adrian begged, saying 25 years of marriage had to mean something. Victoria responded with surgical cruelty that those years meant something when he was the powerful man she married, but that man no longer existed. What was left was just a lifeless body waiting to die. She had already hired top-tier divorce attorneys, and could easily secure half his fortune because his condition rendered him incapable of managing his own affairs. She said he gave her a comfortable life only as long as he was capable of maintaining it. Now he could give her nothing, and she refused to waste her best years changing adult diapers and wiping drool from someone already dead in every way except his name. With those final words, she turned and walked out. 25 years of shared history were erased with the ease of deleting an unwanted text message. There was still a far more devastating blow. His children Thomas, 23, and Isabella, 21, were the children he had raised with utmost devotion, educated in prestigious schools, taken on exotic vacations, and prepared to inherit his empire. Thomas visited exactly 3 times. The first visit lasted barely 20 minutes of suffocating discomfort, his son looking at every object except his father. The second was even briefer. The third and final visit lasted less than 5 minutes. Thomas said the entire situation was too difficult for him to handle, and he could not bear to see his father like this. He preferred to remember him as he was before. Adrian begged his son to stay, saying he needed him. Thomas responded that he had to prioritize his own mental well-being, and that his therapist said he needed healthy personal boundaries. 3 weeks later, Adrian learned Thomas was living in a luxurious beachfront mansion in Miami, spending generously from the early inheritance Victoria had negotiated. Isabella was even more cruel because she was brutally honest. Her last visit occurred 5 months ago. She walked in with perfect makeup and expensive designer clothing, checking her phone constantly. She said she needed to talk about her trust fund right now. Her lawyers told her she could legally access it, given his permanent condition. Adrian explained it was meant for her future, for when she got married and had children. Isabella interrupted that her future was happening right now and they should be realistic. He was never going to recover, never attend her wedding, never meet her children. So why should she wait? Adrian said because he was her father, because he loved her, because he thought their bond meant more than money. Isabella sighed and said love does not pay her bills or provide the lifestyle she deserved. He was an excellent provider when he could do it, but now he was just a burden that Mom did not want. And frankly, neither did they. Adrian pleaded for her not to leave, willing to beg if it meant not being left completely alone. She said she did not have time and would send her lawyer with the paperwork tomorrow. She left, leaving only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the echo of her indifference. That had been the last time Adrian saw either of his children. 5 months of complete silence followed. Now in the crushing solitude of his empty mansion, Adrian stared at the ceiling while the weight of his abandonment crushed him more than any physical paralysis could. He had gone from feared tycoon to less than nothing, a human wreck even his own family refused to see. The only human beings who entered regularly were rotating nurses who kept him alive with competent professionalism but no warmth, no genuine connection, and visible underlying repulsion when they thought he was not looking. One particularly dark night, the nursing service called to inform his assistant they had a staffing emergency and would send someone different. Adrian paid no attention because he no longer cared who took care of him. The door to his room opened around 9 o'clock. Adrian was staring at the ceiling. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," a soft voice said, instantly different from all previous nurses. There was genuine warmth, no forced cheerfulness or distant coldness. Marina Vega entered. She was not a professional nurse, which he knew immediately by her simple uniform and nervous look around the room. She was middle-aged with hair tied back in a simple ponytail, her face showing lines of someone who had known deep suffering but chosen not to let it destroy her. Her brown eyes were filled with compassion that seemed entirely genuine. She introduced herself and said the agency called her to cover the shift because of a family emergency with the regular nurse. She promised to do everything in her power to ensure he was comfortable. Adrian wanted to tell her it did not matter, that she was just another temporary body, but the words stuck when Marina stepped closer and looked directly into his eyes. She did not look away or show any micro-expression of repulsion. There was only recognition, as if she saw him as a complete human being, not a broken body. She asked if he was uncomfortable with his position and would like her to adjust his pillow. It was a simple question but extraordinary because she genuinely waited for his response. She did not assume she knew what was best. Adrian managed a weak sound of assent. Marina adjusted his position with extreme care. Her hands were soft yet secure. Adrian realized something shocking. This woman was not afraid to touch him. She touched him as if he were precious, as if he mattered. After completing the adjustment, she asked if that was better and waited. Adrian confirmed, and for the first time in 8 months, he felt physical comfort. During the following hours, Adrian watched fascinated as Marina performed all necessary tasks with a perfect blend of efficiency and genuine care. When she fed him, she did so in small portions, waiting patiently between each bite, speaking softly about trivial things that demanded no response but did not treat him like an object. She mentioned her youngest son turned 7 last week. He wanted a massive party, but they had to do something small at home. Even so, his smile when blowing out candles on the homemade cake was the most beautiful gift she could have asked for. Adrian found himself genuinely interested in this mundane narrative. For months, the only conversations had been about his medical condition and technical aspects of keeping him alive. Nobody had spoken to him about normal lives or moments of simple joy. It was as if Marina were reminding him that the outside world still existed. But what truly captivated Adrian happened around midnight. Marina had completed all care tasks and checked all monitors. Most nurses would have retired to the waiting room. Instead, she pulled a chair close to his bed. She said she knew he probably could not respond, but asked if she could stay for a while because nights can be very long when one is completely alone. Adrian felt something break inside his chest. This complete stranger had identified exactly what had been his greatest torment. He made a sound of acceptance. Marina smiled and sat, then gently took his paralyzed hand between hers. She explained she had read that human contact is deeply important, even when one cannot physically feel it. Adrian could not feel the touch physically, but felt it emotionally. It was the first genuine non-medical human contact in 8 months. Marina began to speak with a soft cadence that filled the silence. When the agency called, she had almost said no, because she had been working double shifts all week and was exhausted, but she thought about her children and how much she needed the extra money. She paused and sighed. She lost her husband 3 years ago in a workplace accident. A moment of distraction, and their entire life changed forever. Suddenly, she was a single mother of 3, working any job she could find. Adrian felt his heart shudder with empathy towards someone else. For months, he had been so consumed by his own suffering that he had forgotten others also suffered in equally devastating ways. Marina asked what he thought she had learned through all that. Adrian perceived she was sharing something important. She had learned that as long as we have a reason to get up every single morning, as long as there is even one person who needs us to keep going, then life is absolutely worth living. The words fell upon Adrian like water over parched earth. A reason to get up every morning, a person who needs us. He had lost both. His family had abandoned him, his purpose stripped away. Marina gently squeezed his hand and said she knew he probably felt very alone and had thought there was nothing left to live for, but he was completely mistaken. Adrian made a questioning sound. How did she know? Because she was right there holding his hand and could feel his heart still beating. And as long as his heart beats, there is hope. Perhaps not the hope of walking again, but the hope of finding new meanings, new connections, and new reasons to be grateful for every sunrise. It was the most absurdly optimistic thing anyone had said in months. But there was something in the way she said it, weighted with her own experience of loss and pain, that made the words resonate with profound truth. Marina continued, returning to her calm narrative. Her oldest son Gabriel was 13. When his father died, he shut down completely. He did not speak, did not eat, did not want to see anyone. The doctors said he was in shock and needed time, but she knew he needed something more. He needed a reason to believe life could still be beautiful. Adrian wanted to ask what she did but could not. Marina explained. She showed him that even in the deepest darkness there are always glints of light. She did not lie, by saying everything would be perfectly fine. She showed him they could choose what to do with their pain. They could let it destroy them, or transform it into compassion for others who suffer. Adrian felt something shift inside him. For months he had been letting his pain destroy him. But what if there was another option? What if he could still find meaning even in this broken version of himself? The hours passed while Marina continued sharing stories of her children, their struggles and small daily triumphs. Adrian listened to every word, feeling his parched soul drink in this human connection. Near dawn, he noticed Marina's voice coming softer and more spaced out. She was struggling to keep her eyelids open, her body exhausted after her 3rd consecutive shift. She murmured she should not fall asleep and should check the monitors. But before she could finish, her eyes closed involuntarily. She struggled to open them, embarrassed. Adrian wanted to tell her it was okay to rest, that for the first time in months he felt genuinely good just having someone present. But he could not form the words. Marina, losing the battle against exhaustion, softly rested her head on the edge of the bed, right next to where her hand still held Adrian's. Completely exhausted from keeping her family afloat by working impossible shifts, she fell fast asleep. Adrian looked down and saw this practically unknown woman sleeping beside him, still holding his paralyzed hand with such tenderness as if it were something precious that must be protected. Marina's hair had partially escaped from her ponytail and fell over her face. Adrian could see the lines of deep tiredness and worry that marked her skin. In that exact moment, something extraordinary happened inside the dead heart of Adrian Sterling. For the very first time since the accident, he felt something beyond bitterness and self-pity. He felt profound gratitude because this exhausted woman, who clearly had her own monumental struggles, had chosen to treat him like a human being instead of a duty. And then he felt something even more shocking. The sudden fierce desire to protect someone else, to do something, to help this woman who was on the verge of collapse from keeping her family together. For the first time in 8 months, Adrian Sterling wanted to live, not just exist. He wanted to find a way to help this woman who had given him the gift of seeing him as human when everyone else had discarded him as broken garbage. Tears began to roll down his cheeks But for the first time, they were not tears of desperation. They were tears of hope. As dawn began to illuminate the room, Adrian contemplated Marina sleeping beside him and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would find a way to transform his suffering into something meaningful. He would find a way to help this woman and her family. He would prove that even a completely paralyzed man could still make a difference in the world, because Marina had taught him in a single night what months of professional therapy had failed to achieve. That life did not end when you lost everything you thought defined you. Life began anew when you found a reason to care about someone else. Adrian knew with absolute certainty that he had found his new reason to live. What he did not know yet was that discovering the full truth about Marina and her children was going to break his heart in ways he could not even imagine, and that this devastating truth would be exactly what he needed to find his ultimate redemption. The morning light streamed through the curtains. Marina woke with a start, her disoriented eyes scanning the room. Then reality hit. She was still in the chair next to Mr. Sterling's bed, her hand still intertwined with his, her neck aching. She whispered, "Oh my goodness," and sat up immediately, mortified. She apologized profusely, saying this should never have happened and that she was completely irresponsible. If he wanted to report her, she understood. She stopped because Adrian was looking at her in a way she had never seen a patient look at her before. There was no annoyance, no reproach, only gratitude. Marina blinked confusedly, checked the monitors, verified everything was in perfect order, and confirmed Adrian was comfortable. Everything was normal. Then why was he looking at her like that? She asked if he was okay. Adrian made the sound she had learned to interpret as confirmation. Then, with visible effort, moved his eyes toward the window and back to her, signaling the sunrise. Marina turned to the window. The sky was painted in shades of gold and orange. "It is beautiful," she admitted. When she looked back, Adrian's eyes were wet with tears. It was in that moment Marina understood something profound had occurred during the night. This man, who according to agency files had refused to speak with therapists, rejected all visits, and fired 3 nurses in the last month, had listened to her for hours, and it had moved something deep inside him. Her phone vibrated. She answered with the tension of someone carrying far too much weight. Her youngest son had a very high fever. She told Gabriel to give him the syrup and stay with his siblings until she got there. She hung up, and for a second allowed her composure to break, closing her eyes and pressing the phone against her chest. Then she took a deep breath and returned to being the Marina she always was. She told Adrian she needed to leave immediately. The agency would send the morning nurse within the hour. All monitors were fine and medication prepared. Adrian made an urgent sound. Marina turned and saw him staring intently at the small desk where the communication notebook was kept. She asked if he wanted to tell her something and brought the notebook and pen. Letter by letter, Adrian formed 2 words. Marina read them, and her eyes filled with tears she blinked rapidly to contain. The 2 words said, "Come back." It was not an order. It was a genuine request, real vulnerability, the very first brick of something that would change both their lives forever. Marina nodded, pressing the notebook against her chest. "I will return tonight," she promised. As she walked out the door, Adrian did something his own family had sworn they would never see again. He smiled. The Sterling estate had 12 bedrooms, a massive library Adrian would never walk through again, and a perfectly manicured garden the gardeners kept immaculate for absolutely nobody. That afternoon, while the daytime nurse performed his duties in professional silence, Adrian saw none of that. He only saw the empty chair next to his bed. The daytime nurse Roger was efficient, punctual, and completely invisible like all previous professionals. Adrian's mind was in a completely different place. Was Marina's son doing okay? It was an absurd question for a man who, until less than 24 hours ago, had silently decided the world could continue without him. But there he was, genuinely worried about a child he had never seen. Something had awakened inside him that refused to go back to sleep. When the door opened that evening, Adrian knew before seeing her face that it was her, not by the sound of footsteps, but by a shift in the atmosphere of the room. Marina entered with noticeable dark circles under her eyes and a smile that had clearly cost great effort. She said she promised she would return, and here she was. She checked the monitors and said Matteo was doing much better. That was her youngest son's name. The fever broke that morning. She stayed with him until sure he was stable, then left Gabriel in charge. Gabriel, 13, taking care of his younger siblings while his mother worked impossible shifts. The image squeezed Adrian's chest. The agency had asked that morning if she wanted to take his case on a permanent basis. She was not a registered nurse, only had basic caregiving certification she took after her husband's accident so she could care for him at home during recovery. A recovery that never arrived. Normally, she did not accept intensive care cases because her schedules with other jobs were incredibly complicated and she had 3 children she could not afford to fail on any front. But something told her she needed to stay here, so she accepted the position if Adrian had no objection. Adrian did not hesitate. He moved his eyes to the notebook. Marina brought it. He wrote a word quickly. Yes. What Adrian did not know was that this very same afternoon his primary corporate attorney, Ernest Hareland, had been trying to contact him for hours. Hareland told Donald, Adrian's loyal assistant, that Thomas had just filed a formal legal petition to have his father declared legally incompetent. If Adrian did not respond before the end of the week, a judge could grant Thomas total control over the entire estate. Donald came to the mansion and explained with Hareland on speaker. Adrian listened while Marina was present. She asked if she should step out, but Adrian indicated she should stay. Thomas was aggressively arguing that Adrian's physical condition completely prevented him from communicating and making rational decisions. Basically, his own son was trying to convince a judge that he no longer existed as a legal person. Adrian closed his eyes, not out of desperation but out of simmering rage and fierce determination that had been dormant for months and now awakened. He opened his eyes and directed them to Donald. Donald asked what he needed. Adrian moved his eyes to the notebook. Marina held it. Donald spelled out each letter aloud. When finished, Donald read the complete message, "I will fight. Bring the documents." Hareland responded with a voice that for the first time in years lost its cold professional distance. "Welcome back, Adrian." That night when Donald left, Marina performed the nightly care tasks with the same combination of efficiency and warmth Adrian now expected. But there was something different in her expression. A deep worry she was attempting to hide. Adrian asked what happened. She smiled with a smile that admitted defeat with immense grace. Gabriel, her oldest son. They called from his school today. He is having some very serious trouble. Ever since his father died, he has been shutting down more and more. His grades are dropping significantly, and today there was a physical incident with some classmates who were bullying him. Adrian listened and thought of Thomas, his own son who at 23 had chosen cowardice over loyalty, and Gabriel, a 13-year-old carrying the weight of a family while his mother worked impossible shifts. The contrast was painful. Adrian wrote, "Bring him. I want to meet him." Marina looked at him for a long moment. "Are you completely sure?" Adrian's eyes responded before any letter could form. What neither knew was that this meeting would unleash a chain of events that would change not only their lives, but reveal a profound secret Marina had been keeping since before she ever set foot in the mansion. A secret that would change absolutely everything. Gabriel Vega was 13 and possessed the gaze of someone who had seen far too much far too soon. He walked into the Sterling mansion with shoulders hunched and eyes darting in every direction with adolescent awe and learned distrust. He was a slender boy with hands shoved deep into his pockets and hair slightly messy. Marina walked by his side with a gentle hand on his shoulder. When they entered Adrian's room, Gabriel stopped dead in the doorway. His eyes scanned the large space, the flashing monitors, the specialized bed, the medical equipment, and finally, the man who lay completely motionless but wide awake, looking at him with intense attention. Gabriel asked directly if Adrian could hear him. Adrian moved his eyes up and down. "Yes. And do you understand everything I am saying?" "Same movement." "Yes." Gabriel processed this, then nodded as if he had internally resolved something. "Then it is fine," he said simply, and sat down in the chair next to the bed with the naturalness of someone who had been visiting for years. During the first hour, Gabriel spoke very little and observed far more. He looked at the monitors with technical curiosity and asked occasional questions about how the communication system functioned. Adrian observed, fascinated by this boy, who processed the world differently from any adult. There was absolutely no pity in Gabriel's gaze. Every adult who walked into the room brought an invisible layer of pity that made Adrian feel reduced to his physical condition. But Gabriel looked at him with analytical curiosity and completely without judgment. It was during the second hour, when the nature of the conversation shifted. Marina had stepped out, and Donald was on a call in the adjacent living room. Gabriel and Adrian were completely alone. The boy kept silence for a brief moment. Then, without preamble, "My mom cries when she thinks we cannot see her. She works way too hard. She gets home and asks how we are, makes dinner, checks Mateo's and my sister Valeria's homework, and when she thinks we are all asleep, she sits in the kitchen and just cries. I can hear her from my room." Gabriel continued, looking at his hands. When his dad died, she told them everything was going to be perfectly fine, and he believed her because he desperately needed to. But he is 13 now, and already knows things are not always fine, even if someone says they are. Adrian felt the immense weight of those words. This 13-year-old child had already learned the hardest lesson of adulthood, that genuine love is sometimes expressed in pious lies, and everything is going to be fine, said with a firm voice, while the heart is collapsing inside. Gabriel lifted his eyes and looked directly at Adrian. "Are you completely alone too?" It was a simple, direct, completely devastating question. Adrian felt something break and simultaneously weld together inside his chest. The honest answer was that yes, he had been completely alone. But in this exact moment, with this boy looking at him without filters, he felt entirely the opposite. He moved his eyes toward the left. "Not so alone anymore," the boy said, not as a question but as a firm confirmation. And Adrian, for the third time since Marina had crossed the threshold, felt his eyes fill with tears. Marina returned to find her son and Adrian in a silence that was clearly not uncomfortable, but the opposite. She placed cups on the side table and watched them for a moment without either noticing her presence. She saw Gabriel's posture relaxed and open without the permanent tension he had carried for years, and Adrian's eyes alive and completely focused on her son with the exact same attention he had paid to her since the first night. Something deep in Marina's chest shifted in a way she could not fully name. Then Donald returned from the living room with the phone still in his hand and an expression that completely erased any warmth. He needed to speak with Marina outside right now. In the corridor, Donald looked at her with the expression of someone about to say something that would hurt deeply. Mr. Hareland investigated her background with the agency as standard procedure for a high-profile client. Marina nodded slowly. Donald paused, looking torn. Why didn't she tell them that she knew who Adrian was before that first night? The silence that followed was entirely different. Marina's hands hung completely still at her sides. She asked what exactly Mr. Hareland found. That her late husband Richard Vega worked for 11 years at Vertex Industrial, the exact same company Adrian acquired a few years ago, and liquidated 6 months after acquisition, leaving over 140 workers completely without employment or their full severance packages. The accident that cost Richard his life occurred on a Vertex Industrial job site exactly 3 weeks before the company was permanently closed. A closure Adrian Sterling personally signed. Donald asked if she knew who Adrian was when she arrived that first night. The response took time. When Marina opened her eyes, there was something incredibly complex and raw in them. "Yes," she said simply. "I knew." Donald entered the room first. Marina followed. Adrian detected the shift immediately. Gabriel noticed too, and was sent to wait in the living room with Donald. Marina approached the chair by Adrian's bed slowly, sat down, and for a long moment simply looked at him with that disarming honesty that had been her hallmark from the very first moment. She supposed he already knew. Adrian indicated yes. She wanted him to know something before he decided whatever he wanted to decide. Her voice was firm but not harsh, wounded but far from broken. When she arrived that first night, she came with the heavy weight of years of unanswered questions. Her husband died on that job site because the safety protocols the company promised were never implemented. He died leaving her completely alone with 3 young children. And the man who signed the closure of that company was lying right in this bed. Adrian listened without ever pulling his eyes away. But what she found here, Marie continued, her voice cracking slightly before she recovered, was not the man she expected to find. She found someone who was also completely alone, who had also been abandoned, who was also carrying a massive weight he had not asked to carry. A single tear rolled down her cheek and she made no movement to wipe it away. And she could not bring herself to hate that man, no matter how hard a part of her tried. The silence that followed was the most profoundly honest Adrian had experienced in years. He moved his eyes to the notebook. Marina brought it close and waited. Adrian's response took more time than ever before. Letter by letter, with slowness that was not limitation but absolute deliberate intent, he constructed the most important message he had written since losing the movement of his limbs. When he finished, Marina read the words in silence, and this time the tears were not just one but many, falling freely without the slightest attempt to stop them. The message said, "You have every right to hate me, but if you give me the chance, I will spend the rest of my remaining life trying to earn the forgiveness I do not deserve." Marina took a long moment to respond. Finally, she extended her hand and took Adrian's with the exact same tenderness of the very first night. Only now it was entirely different. Now it was the gesture of two deeply wounded people whose scars were fundamentally connected, choosing against all logic and all past pain not to drown each other, but to see if together they could keep each other afloat. She said she did not come here to destroy him. She came to understand. What she had understood is that pain is never healed with more pain. The storm arrived exactly 3 days after Marina confessed the truth. Donald walked in with the most tense face Adrian had ever seen, followed by Harland. Marina lifted her eyes and knew immediately something terrible had occurred. They needed to talk right now. Thomas's attorneys had presented this to the judge that morning. Donald opened a thick legal folder. Inside were numerous surveillance photographs. Marina holding Adrian's hand while sleeping that first night, moving the communication notebook close to him, Marina and Adrian looking at each other with expressions any outside observer could easily misinterpret as something far more than caregiver and patient, and the most devastating one of all. Gabriel sitting next to the bed laughing genuinely with Adrian in a moment clearly showing real affection. Thomas was aggressively arguing that Adrian was being heavily manipulated emotionally by Marina, that she was using her position to gain access to his fortune, and that she was involving her minor children in an elaborate scheme of undue influence over a vulnerable, incapacitated man. The silence was absolute. Marina looked at the photographs with an expression that went from shock to comprehension and finally to absolute terror. Not terror for herself, but terror for her children. There was more. They had filed an emergency motion arguing that Marina represented an immediate danger to Adrian and must be removed immediately as caregiver. That was absurd, Marina said, but her voice had lost all strength. Harland said there was something significantly worse. They had also contacted Child Protective Services. Marina turned completely pale. They were formally arguing that Marina was severely neglecting her own children to dedicate excessive time to Adrian, and that she was using her children, specifically Gabriel, to emotionally manipulate an incapacitated man. They had already scheduled an emergency assessment visit to her apartment to investigate the conditions in which her children were living. The words fell upon Marina like heavy stones. Adrian saw her literally stagger back, gripping the edge of the bed tightly. "No," she whispered, her voice completely broken. "They cannot take my children away from me. I work 3 jobs to provide everything they need. They are safe. They are loved. I would never—" Harland interrupted with firmness that attempted to be comforting but could not hide the real gravity. He knew she would not, and they were going to prove that in court. But she needed to prepare for what was coming. They were going to investigate absolutely everything. Her finances, work schedules, the physical conditions of her home, and the emotional state of the children. Marina closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was painful resolution. She would resign from the caregiver position right now. She would call the agency and demand they send someone else immediately. No, the word came out of Adrian with a clarity that made everyone spin around to look at him. It had not been an ambiguous sound or a slow, laboriously coded attempt. It had been a complete, distinct syllable formed with all the strength of muscles unused for speech for months. Adrian moved his eyes to the notebook with urgency that admitted no delay. Marina, with trembling hands, held the paper. The message Adrian wrote took far more time than any other previous message, but each letter was placed with absolute determination. When he finished, Donald read aloud with a voice that shook slightly, "You are not going to resign. They are not going to take your children away from you. And Thomas is not going to win, because I am going to that hearing myself. I am going to speak, and I am going to tell the absolute truth." The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality. Herland said slowly that for them to have Adrian testify, they must legally prove he could communicate effectively, and that his cognitive faculties were completely intact. Thomas's lawyers were going to viciously argue that anything Adrian said was being heavily manipulated by Marina, or by them. Adrian looked at him, and in his eyes there was the look of someone who had decided that losing was simply not an option. He moved his eyes to the notebook again. The message was shorter but equally powerful. "Then bring me the absolute best neurologist in the country. I want a full, independent cognitive evaluation, and I want it to begin today." Herland looked at Donald. Donald looked at Marina, and Marina looked at Adrian with an expression blending profound gratitude, terror, and something much deeper neither was ready to name yet. That night, when Marina was preparing to leave, Gabriel arrived with her to pick her up. The boy walked into the room and knew immediately something was deeply wrong. Marina told him everything about the surveillance photographs, the malicious accusations, and the threat from Child Protective Services with the absolute honesty she had always used with her children, because she believed they deserved to know the reality of the world they lived in. Gabriel listened in absolute silence, his expression darkening with each passing detail. And when Marina finished, the boy turned toward Adrian with an expression that was no longer that of a 13-year-old child, but of someone much older. "Is it true what my mom said, that you are going to fight for us?" Adrian moved his eyes up and down. "Yes, why?" It was a fair question deserving a far more complete response. Adrian moved his gaze to the notebook. Gabriel held it this time. The message took shape letter by letter. "Because you and your family reminded me that I am still a human being, and because human beings protect the ones they love." Gabriel read the words in silence twice, then without saying a single word stepped closer and wrapped his arms around Adrian, hugging him with the typical awkwardness of an adolescent, but with the absolute sincerity of someone who had never learned how to fake affection. Adrian could not return the physical embrace, but something deep within his chest that had been dead for months ignited with a warmth he had not felt since long before the accident. Marina watched the scene with her hands over her mouth, choking back the sobs that threatened to escape. Donald finally broke the emotional moment, approaching with a highly serious expression. There was something else they needed to know. Herland just received a call from one of his contacts at the courthouse. Thomas was aggressively pushing to have the emergency hearing moved up. He wanted to force a rapid judicial resolution before they had any time to prepare a solid certified defense. Adrian processed this critical information, then moved his eyes to the notebook. The message was brief but absolutely clear. "I want to see Thomas. Tell him to come here tonight." Thomas Sterling entered the mansion without announcing himself, as he had done his entire life. He was a young man with the posture of someone who grew up believing the world owed him everything, and the last months had hardened him in a way far from flattering. He possessed his father's eyes, but where Adrian's now carried deep depth earned. Through profound loss, Thomas's carried nothing but cold calculation. Donald attempted to intercept him but failed. Thomas pushed the door open and stopped dead in the threshold. What he saw completely dislocated his expectations. He expected to find the utterly defeated man of his recent memories. Instead, he found his father looking at him with attention so fixed and charged, with intense energy that by pure instinct he took a step backward. Marina was present, standing quietly by the massive window. Donald entered behind Thomas and closed the door firmly. Thomas began with manufactured authority, blended with something that could have been deep guilt. He knew Adrian had been informed about the legal petition, and needed him to understand it was entirely for his own long-term good. Adrian could not continue living like this, surrounded by people he did not know, letting complete strangers make monumental decisions for him. Adrian's silence was so profoundly eloquent that Thomas became visibly uncomfortable. This primitive communication system, with the notebook, could be easily manipulated by anyone in the room. How did a judge know the words were truly his and not hers? Adrian moved his eyes to Donald. Donald brought the notebook close without a single word. Adrian, with the same implacable patience he had learned to convert into a powerful weapon, began to write letter by letter without any rush. Thomas watched with growing impatience. Marina did not move an inch from the window. When Adrian finished, Donald read the message aloud with a steady voice. "You are right about one thing, Thomas. There is a deep secret that nobody knows. It is time for you to know it now." Thomas furrowed his brow, his confidence wavering. It was not at all what he had expected. Adrian returned to the notebook. This time the message took much longer. Donald read each fragment aloud as it was formed, and as the words took shape, Thomas's expression began to change in a manner nobody had anticipated. "When I acquired Vertex Industrial, I immediately ordered an intensive internal audit. What we found was absolutely devastating. The project managers had been systematically falsifying safety and structural logs for years. The conditions in which those men were working were completely illegal. They were lying to the executive board every single day. I gave them exactly 90 days to correct every single safety violation, or I would close the firm down permanently. They refused. I closed it. What I was unable to do before my catastrophic accident was open the major compensation trust fund I had fully prepared for the affected families. The silence that followed was entirely different from all previous silences. Marina had stopped looking out the window. Her eyes were fixed on the handwritten words, with an expression that crossed from sheer astonishment to deep emotional pain, and then to something that had no easy name, making her hands tremble slightly. Donald responded before anyone else could, "Mr. Hareland has the complete certified documentation. Adrian was fully intending to proceed legally against those corrupt managers right before the accident. Everything is securely archived in the legal vaults." Thomas did not speak a single word. He looked at his father with a completely new expression, like someone who had just discovered that the map they had been using to navigate their entire life was fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. "Dad," Thomas said finally, and for the first time in months, his voice carried absolutely no calculation or manufactured urgency, only the raw voice of a son who had just understood that he had judged blindly before ever knowing the truth. "I did not know any of this." Adrian looked at him for a long, quiet moment, then moved his eyes to the notebook one final time. Donald held it as Adrian wrote, "I know you didn't. That is exactly why I am telling you now." Thomas dropped heavily into the chair next to the bed, not because anyone had invited him, but because his legs simply refused to support his weight anymore. Dr. Camila Ruiz arrived a few days later with her specialized medical team from the Rocky Mountain Neurological Institute and spent 3 full exhaustive sessions evaluating Adrian with a methodology she described as the most rigorous available globally for patients with severe paralysis. She was a woman of precise movements and direct, piercing questions who did not fake superficial compassion but did not hide her profound professional respect either. She worked with Adrian as if he were exactly what he was, a brilliant, completely intact mind inhabiting a body that refused to respond. At the conclusion of the final session, she spread her extensive medical report over the table, and some summarized her findings while standing. "The cognitive faculties of Mr. Adrian Sterling are completely and perfectly preserved. His capacity for complex reasoning, memory, abstract logic, and independent decision-making shows absolutely zero deterioration. The communication system he utilizes is entirely valid, reliable, and scientifically verifiable." She gathered her materials with characteristic efficiency. She would defend this report in a court of law with absolute scientific certainty. Donald let out a long breath he had been holding for days. Marina squeezed her eyes shut for a brief instant, letting pure relief wash through her before recomposing herself. Adrian from his bed observed them all, and in his eyes there was something Dr. Ruiz detected before she walked out. A crystalline clarity, not the cold, calculating clarity of the billionaire businessman he had once been, but the far more difficult clarity that only arrives when someone has lost absolutely everything and has chosen against all human logic to build anew. Thomas formally withdrew the legal petition 4 days before the scheduled hearing. He did so completely without a press release, without calls to his high-profile attorneys, and without any of the dramatic, aggressive gestures that had characterized his legal offensive. He sent Hareland a direct, brief message the veteran attorney read twice before calling Donald with a voice carrying something resembling genuine surprise. Isabella called the mansion directly that very same afternoon. Donald placed the call on speaker, and Adrian listened to his daughter's voice, which sounded entirely different from the last time, completely devoid of the calculated sharp edges that had defined her in recent months. "Dad," Isabella said, her voice cracking on the very second syllable. "Thomas told me everything you said about Vertex Industrial and about the Compensation Trust Fund." A long, heavy pause. "I didn't ask you anything. I just went straight to judging you without ever asking for your side, and that was—" She could not finish the sentence. Adrian waited patiently. "Can I please come visit you?" Isabella asked finally. "No lawyers, no legal documents, just me." Adrian moved his eyes to the notebook. Donald held it, and Adrian wrote, "Yes." It was far from the beginning of a perfect magical reconciliation, because real wounds do not heal in a single phone call or brief visit, but it was a door left open. Adrian, who had learned over the past months that an open door was more than enough when, accompanied by real human, Will accepted it for exactly what it was. The inspection visit from Child Protective Services to Marina's home was brief and definitive. The investigator found a small but immaculately clean apartment, 3 children who looked at their mother with a deep trust that can never be faked, and a tight but highly functional family economy that demonstrated not neglect but constant immense personal sacrifice. Gabriel answered the investigator's questions with that baffling maturity that characterized him. Valeria, the middle child, an 11-year-old girl with observant eyes, proudly showed her schoolwork that filled her notebooks. Mateo, the youngest, fell fast asleep on the sofa, during the visit entirely oblivious to the gravity of the moment, possessing the absolute peace of children who feel entirely safe. The investigator closed her official folder and looked Marina straight in the eyes. "There is absolutely no reason to continue this investigation. Your children are exceptionally well cared for." Marina waited until the door closed firmly before she dropped into a kitchen chair and wept with all the weight of weeks of pent-up terror. Gabriel appeared in the doorway of his room, looked at her, and without saying a single word, crossed the room and hugged her from behind, resting his head on her shoulder with the sincere awkwardness of his 13 years. Valeria arrived seconds later, wrapping her arms around her from the other side. Mateo continued sleeping peacefully on the sofa, and Marina Vega, who had carried a crushing weight alone for years that would have broken anyone else, finally allowed her children to hold her up. Weeks after the legal dust had completely settled, Adrian summoned Harland and Donald to his room with a purpose neither anticipated. The message he constructed that morning in the notebook was the longest he had written since the day of his accident. Donald read it aloud while Harland took meticulous notes. Adrian wanted 2 monumental things done immediately. First, he ordered the immediate activation and full funding of the Compensation Trust for the families of all the workers of Vertex Industrial who had been left without their complete severance packages. Every single family, without a single exception, including that of Richard Vega. Second, he ordered the creation of a massive philanthropic foundation in the name of Richard Vega, completely dedicated to providing full educational scholarships for the children of workers who lost their lives in workplace accidents due to corporate negligence. Harland lowered his pen and looked at Adrian over his glasses with an expression the veteran attorney rarely showed. "This will significantly reduce your personal net worth and estate, Adrian." Adrian moved his eyes. Donald held the notebook. "I know. Are you completely and absolutely sure about this?" Adrian's eyes responded with fierce intensity before any words could even form on the paper. Harland nodded a single time and immediately returned to his legal pad. Marina learned of it that afternoon when Donald told her in the hallway before she entered the room. She stood entirely still in the corridor for a long moment, her hand resting against the wall, letting the massive information settle into a place within her where pain and profound gratitude had learned to peacefully coexist. When she entered the room, Adrian was looking at her as he always did, with that complete attention that had never learned to be anything other than entirely honest. Marina brought the notebook close without being asked. She held it and waited. Adrian wrote a single sentence. Marina read it a second time, and then lifted her eyes toward him with an expression that was not merely gratitude, but something far deeper and more difficult to name. The expression of someone who has carried a long history of deep pain and has discovered that this history, without anyone planning, it ended up being the exact path towards something they could have never found in any other way. The sentence said, "Your husband deserves to be remembered by something that lasts forever." Sometime later in the grand garden that the gardeners had kept immaculate for absolutely nobody. For months there were vibrant voices. Matteo was running wildly between the manicured bushes with that unlimited energy of young children who need absolutely no reason to move. Valeria was reading quietly, sitting on the stone bench under the massive oak tree, with her legs tucked beneath her, completely inhabiting the world of her pages. Gabriel was walking slowly along the stone path, talking directly with Donald about something that made the young assistant laugh with a genuine booming laugh the mansion had never heard before. From the large window of his bedroom, Adrian observed it all. Marina was right by his side in the chair that was now permanently her chair. The chair nobody had dared to move because it had acquired the silent, immense weight of things that truly matter in this life. Gabriel brought his grades up successfully. Marina said in a low voice, looking out toward the garden. "Last week he showed me an essay he wrote for his English class about real resilience." She smiled with that smile Adrian had learned to read as the most honest of all her expressions. "He wrote about his father, and he wrote about you." Adrian felt something that no longer surprised him, but never ceased to deeply move him. The profound warmth of knowing that he mattered. Not because of his fortune, not because of his powerful last name, and not because of what he could financially provide, buy, or sign, but because of who he was, because of what he had actively chosen to be after losing absolutely everything he thought defined him. Marina turned her head and looked at him softly. "Do you know what I have learned through all of this?" she asked, and her voice possessed that soft cadence of conversations that do not require an explicit answer to make complete sense. Adrian waited. "I learned that forgiveness does not erase the past pain," Marina said. "The pain remains there, but when you actively choose to release the weight of carrying it completely alone, you discover that your hands are finally left free to hold other things." She looked out toward the garden again, where her children were filling a space with vibrant life that had once been pure, stagnant solitude, things that are worth so much more. Outside, Matteo shouted something that made Valeria laugh aloud, and the pure sound reached all the way up into the room like something that could not fit into any known corporate category except for the simplest and most profound one of all: life. Adrian felt his eyes moisten, but not with sadness. It had been a long time since his tears had been of sadness. He looked at the garden, he looked at Marina, and he looked at her hands, which held his with the exact same tenderness of that very first night when everything was absolute darkness, and she had arrived carrying, without ever knowing it, the only key that could open what remained of his heart. And Adrian Sterling, the man who for months had stared blankly at a ceiling, waiting for life to end, discovered that what he had laid out before him was not the end of a tragic story. It was, with all its fragility and all its immense bravery, the true, beautiful beginning of one. The ultimate lesson that reveals itself through the long, winding tapestry of human existence is that we are never truly defined by the storms we encounter, but rather by the profound grace with which we rebuild our lives in their aftermath. To grow old is to understand that the grand structures we spend our youth frantically constructing, the empires of wealth, the fortresses of social status, and the illusions of absolute control, are remarkably fragile things capable of being swept away in a single, unyielding instant of cosmic redirection. True maturity lies in the painful but liberating realization that our worth as human beings is never tied to our physical capacity, our independent strength, or the worldly power we wield over others, but is instead entirely anchored in our capacity to love, to extend mercy, and to allow ourselves to be deeply vulnerable in the presence of another soul. When we are stripped of everything we once believed gave us identity, we are presented with a stark, terrifying choice. We can either allow the lingering shadows of bitterness and self-pity to consume us entirely, turning our hearts into fortresses of isolation, or we can choose to open our eyes to the quiet, unassuming grace that often stands right beside us in our darkest hours. Forgiveness is not a passive act of forgetting past wrongs, nor is it a validation of the pain that has been inflicted upon us. Rather, it is a fierce, courageous decision to unburden our souls from the crushing weight of resentment so that our hands may be entirely free to foster healing and compassion. We discover as the years advance that the most profound connections are often forged in the fires of shared brokenness, where the illusions of perfection are completely discarded, leaving only the raw, beautiful reality of two human beings choosing to hold each other up against the gravity of despair. True legacy is never written in stone monuments or legal trusts, but is gently etched into the lives of those we choose to protect, to uplift, and to love without condition. In the end, as the evening of life approaches and the superficial noise of the world fades into distant echoes, we find that the only currency that possesses any true lasting value is the depth of the love we have shared, the peace we have cultivated within our hearts, and the profound knowledge that even from the absolute ruins of a shattered existence, something infinitely beautiful, meaningful, and enduring can still be courageously born.